Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Double Take here on the IEA YouTube channel. I'm Emily Carver, Head of Media at the Institute of Economic Affairs. This is the show where we get two expert opinions on two of the biggest stories of the week, one culture story and one economic story. If you enjoy this episode, please do give it a like, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment down below. So you'd have to have been living under a rock to miss the biggest culture story of the week, the continuing row over trans women in sports. It seems to me that this issue should be pretty clear-cut. If you're born biologically male, you shouldn't be allowed to compete in the women's category. Women's sports are exclusive by definition and therefore should remain so. Here with me to explore a liberal approach to this thorny issue is Dr. Kristian Niemietz, Head of Political Economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hi, Kristian.
Hello.
So, Kristian, have I got a bit of an outdated view on this all? By banning Emily Bridges from competing in the women's cycling, are we turning the clock back on transgender rights, as some have said?
Well, I have a fairly conventional liberal approach to this. I would say I would simply treat sports leagues as private enterprises or associations of private enterprises, and I would say they should be free to come up with their own rules. And what we should get is a discovery process, a market discovery process between different rules. You could have one sports league saying we are biological purists. Here you can only compete on the team according to the biological sex you were born with, and no discussion around that. You could have a different league that comes up with a different set of rules. Let's say some which make it very easy to cross that boundary, and others which are somewhere in between, which say, well, yes, you can under some circumstances, but we have a very high threshold. You have to meet some very strict criteria. Seems to me that sports leagues are in the best, are the organizations that are best placed to make that decision, not just because they know most about their particular sports. They certainly know more about it than Twitter culture warriors, including ourselves. But also because I think they face the right incentives. They have to draw up their rules in such a way that it appeals to the people who want to watch those sports. And those are not necessarily the Twitter culture warriors or the ones who go on TV to talk about it. What they have to balance is conflicting objectives here. You don't want to, if you organize sports competitions, you don't want to come up with rules that seem unfair to most of your viewers, because irrespective of where they stand on culture war issues, if something is seen as clearly unfair, that would ruin the sports for you. I mean, I don't know much about either of those sports. I don't watch them, but I would assume this is something that's universal. If you watch any spectator sport, something that you consider unfair, that would ruin it for you. But also sports leagues, just like any organizer of anything, like any company in a marketplace, don't want to be seen as unreasonably exclusionary or discriminatory. The whole problem I have with this, with the way it's going now, is that even though supposedly sports leagues can make their own rules, it's not, at the moment, it's not driven by political decisions. There's not going to be a vote in the House of Commons on whether this cyclist is allowed to be part of this.
But on that, Kristian, should not the government be taking a firm position on this? Because it's down to their messy legislation that I think we're in this position where institutions don't really know what to do about this issue. Because on the one hand, you've got the Gender Recognition Act, which essentially means that someone biologically male, even before they've gone through sex reassignment surgery, can legally be a male. So under the law, they're considered female. And then you've got also the Equalities Act, which talks about the right legal provisions for women's only spaces. So there's a lot of confusion. It doesn't seem to sit too comfortably. Surely we need the government to spell this one out a bit. You know, in the US, we've seen 13 states bring in laws barring male-born athletes from competing against females. Should we not follow suit?
Well, we should certainly clarify the legal situation. That's the whole problem. Because even though at the moment, notionally, sports leagues can come up with their own rules. As I said, it is not a political decision in the sense that you have a parliamentary vote on it. But I nonetheless don't buy the claim that that these decisions are purely voluntary at the moment. The Leah Thomas decision, of course, it's not that U.S. Congress had a vote on this, or that there is a specific law which says trans women have to be included in on the women's swimming team. It's just that I would imagine if you are making those decisions and the legal situation is not 100% clear, you would be terrified of getting sued, of anti-discrimination claims. And if we want sports leagues, organizers of sporting events to be in a position where they can make these decisions independently, you have to give them absolute legal certainty. You have to tell them, look, don't worry about anti-discrimination laws. They're not going to apply to you. Whatever decision you make, you are not going to be sued. You are free to do this in whatever way you see fit. And then you can let the market sort it out. If they are seen as unreasonably discriminatory, then they would lose viewers because of that. And there would be a backlash. And it would then be a free decision in that sense. Now, that doesn't mean that that they will not cave into to pressure from woke progressives, because we often see this in that companies cave in even when they don't legally have to. It's just that those are the people who make the most amount, the most noise. And companies often pander to the loudest voices. That could also happen in sports. So it's not giving them some opt-outs from discrimination laws doesn't mean that you have a guarantee that that the outcomes will be radically different. But at least you have legal clarity and quite different incentives. If it is a case like this one with the swimming competition, there you did have quite a bit of a backlash, and I think the sports league would realize this is seen as unfair by many of our viewers, and we're going to lose viewers because of that. So they would probably be prepared to take a bit of a risk to stand up to the woke mob for once. In other situations, they may not. But if it's a situation where you really are under pressure, you might lose customers, you might lose viewers, then you might be a bit more courageous in standing up to the woke mob.
Yeah, I do think the debate on this is very much shifting now that people are seeing it firsthand. I mean, no one can deny really that Leah Thomas clearly had some kind of biological advantage out of the fact of being born male and going through what do you call it when you grow up, going through puberty as a boy. But I've still seen a couple of arguments put forward as to why including trans women in women's sports is a progressive move. It's not a threat to women's rights. One such argument is that sport is not a level playing field anyway. So, having been born biologically male is the same as, I don't know, one woman being taller than another, one woman having, broader shoulders than the other. And The Independent, which you showed me, they published a report to this effect. It said that the statistics show that there's little evidence that Leah Thomas had an unfair advantage. They say a woman's gender history should not be treated differently from any other natural bodily variations. I can't make sense of that. Can you? Do you think the government will be able to make sense of this all?
Well, I think what happens here is that a lot of people are using this to signal their progressive credentials. So they try to reason their way to the conclusion that is the most fashionable. And that's why we see a lot of willful ignorance from The Independent here in particular. What they do here is they pretend not to understand how normal distributions work. To say that men are faster swimmers than women, that's like saying that Spain has a warmer climate than Britain. Of course, this is not true every single day. Of course, Britain sometimes has heat waves, and Spain sometimes has cold snaps. If you look for it, you can find days when it's actually warmer here than in Spain. But it's nonetheless true to say that Spain has a warmer climate. it's true in the sense that if you compare like with like, Spain will always win on the temperature front. By like with like, I mean, if you look at the average temperature in Britain, you have to compare that to the average temperature in Spain. If you look at a heat wave in Britain, you have to compare that to a heat wave in Spain, and so forth. And it's the same here. It's the same with biological characteristics that are relevant for sports. I think it shouldn't be controversial to say that on average, men are taller than women. Now, of course, you have an average value and then normal distribution or something close to normal distributions around it. This obviously doesn't mean that every man in the world is taller than every woman in the world. Tall women are, of course, taller than short men. But nonetheless, if you compare men and women at particular points of the height distribution, if you say you compare the median to the male median to the female median, or the 90th percentile of the male height distribution to the 90th percentile of the female height distribution, then it will always be the man who is taller than the woman. And that's the same. That's what the Independent article is getting wrong there. They are looking at specifically the winners of previous competitions on the women's team. So essentially, they're looking at the fastest female swimmers of that year in the country. So they specifically go to the very, very, very top of that ability distribution. And then, yes, of course, if you compare that to a transgender athlete or a male athlete, of course, those women, by being the very best, they will of course be faster swimmers than most men, and it's
yeah, I think this is why they're talking about meaningful competition instead of fairness in competition, i.e., as long as the transgender athlete can be beaten or isn't essentially better than all of the women, then there's still a meaningful competition. But that seems to be madness to me. But I think, as well as sort of distorting the data, I think the progressive, left, woke, whatever you want to call it, seem to think that, reality doesn't really matter anymore. If, truth is simply subjective, is being a woman and being a man just a social construct? And then, of course, that brings with it many tensions with different groups of rights. And this is particularly, we see this most when it comes to this transgender debate, this transgender row.
Yeah, in a sense, this whole issue is actually spectacularly badly suited to the gender culture wars that we're normally having, because most of the culture war issues around transgender rights are about identity, and the question to what extent you can decouple gender identity from biological sex. Now, if we're talking about the rules of sports leagues are clearly not interested in any of that. If you want to join a swimming team and they ask you, are you a man or a woman? They're not interested in your identity. They're not asking, do you behave in ways that are considered typically feminine? They're not making a philosophical statement on what's the essence of femininity or masculinity. They don't want to know whether you, find it easier to identify with male characters or female characters when you watch a movie. They're clearly just asking about physical characteristics that are relevant to that sport, such as muscle mass and testosterone levels, and average height again. So they're clearly just talking about biological characteristics, and therefore I'd say we could decouple that in principle from the whole culture war issue. It doesn't really matter how you think of gender identity. Normally, I think it would be perfectly coherent even for a progressive to say, yes, I do believe that gender identity is mutable and can be changed quite quickly. However, even if somebody is, even if Leah Thomas is a woman for most intents and purposes, for sports purposes, that's a different story. Here, it's really purely about biological characteristics, and therefore that's the only thing that matters. And if a sports league said we are not accepting trans women, I don't see that as discriminatory in the sense that they would make a statement about whether their identity is valid or not. That could all be perfectly valid. They would just say, okay, yes, of course, you can live your life as a woman. Absolutely no problem with that. Just not on this competition here.
So on the meaningful competition point, if in this scenario you have a biological male or someone who's grew up as a man and then has transitioned, and they're not top of the field, they're not outpacing all of the women, is that then fair? Is that a meaningful competition because they're not taking victory every time?
Yes, well, I think this is one of those examples where you have progressives being willfully ignorant in order to reason themselves to the conclusion they want to reach, the fashionable conclusion, because they're fighting a straw man here. Nobody has claimed, as far as I know, that if someone is biologically male, that they will always win every competition. The point is just that it gives you a very big advantage. But then this is like, let's say, playing with a loaded dice. If you have a dice that is loaded in such a way that the number 6 comes up more often, of course, that doesn't mean that it comes up every single time. And if you play a game where the number 6 works in your favor, you will still sometimes lose, or you might even have bad days when you lose several games. But nonetheless, if you play this 1,000 times with the loaded dice, you will get the number 6, of course, more often than you would with a standard dice. It will be some number that is well above 1 in 6. And this is the same thing. The argument is just that that having biological male characteristics gives you advantages in some sports. And now this doesn't mean that you automatically, someone who's biologically male will always win every sport. But nonetheless, if we had, let's say, if all the sports leagues now took a very permissive stance, saying any trans woman can automatically participate and no strict criteria there for what exactly that transition process has to look like. If you had, say, over the years, thousands of trans athletes competing in women's leagues, then I think it's pretty clear that they would be vastly overrepresented among the winners. They would obviously not win every single time, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an issue. But it would just be the loaded dice argument again.
Of course, you have one woman is taller than another woman. One woman might have broader shoulders that are better for swimming, or they might have bigger feet that makes them faster at running, I don't know, or just bigger muscles from their nature, from birth. What do you say to that?
Well, there is a trade-off, of course, here, that if you organize sports competitions, you want to create something closer to a level playing field. But at the same time, you don't want to have hundreds or thousands of different leagues, because for the viewers, you probably have some favorite athletes and you want to see them sometimes compete against each other. Now, if they're all in different leagues because you split it in hundreds of different ways, then that's not going to happen. So therefore, it's a trade-off here between fairness and simplicity, and you have to find a cut-off point somewhere. But therefore, there's nothing inconsistent or hypocritical about saying we will separate people according to this criteria, but not according to every criteria that you could imagine. That's the trade-off with the weight classes in boxing, that they have some differentiation, that of course somebody who weighs 120 kilos will not be in the same league as somebody who weighs 50 kilos. But they don't split it in such a way that you create thousands of different leagues. There is a trade-off here, and you have to find a cutoff point somewhere. And that's why I would simply say, leave this to the sports leagues and let them come up with the optimum number. But there's nothing hypocritical about saying we have men's and women's teams, but we don't have different teams for every height band or every weight band. Because, well, you still need, you still want the simplicity of having your favorite athletes sometimes compete against each other. But then that's not a matter of principle. If a swimming league said we also want to have different height groups, or we also want to have different weight groups or whatever, then I wouldn't see a problem with that. In principle, of course, they could do that.
Yes, it would just be very complex and time-consuming, and probably not all that fun for people who are spectators. If there were hundreds of different leagues for everyone who had one physical advantage or one disadvantage, it would be an absolute shambles. So yeah, there's obviously that trade-off when it comes to simplicity. I would just say, let's just have an open category so everybody, regardless of their gender, sex, can compete, but they can't compete in the biological sex category that they were not born in. I think it should be simple as that. And if there aren't too many competitors in that category, then so be it. But at least that allows people to exercise their what could be perceived as a human right to compete and at the sport you love. I think that would be fair.
Yep. Although we can probably guess who would opt into that league.
Yes, we can probably guess who would. It doesn't seem to happen the other way. You don't see many trans men competing in the men's boxing. I don't suppose. I imagine that would be very dangerous. Thank you for your time, Kristian. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Double Take. Right, now let's turn our attention to one of the biggest economic stories of the week. We were told on Tuesday in no uncertain terms that the COVID spending party is over for public services. Why? Well, one of the main reasons the Treasury has given is that our debt interest payments, i.e. the amount we spend servicing our colossal debt pile, has quadrupled to a staggering £83 billion for 2022-23. This figure sounds pretty alarming. It's the equivalent of what the government is spending on defence, or £1,325 for every single person in this country. But is that right? I'm joined now by Julian Jessop, independent economist and economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, to look a bit into the detail on this subject. So Julian, you've pointed out that comparing this massive debt interest bill, this rather daunting figure of £83 billion that we owe in interest payments alone, to departmental spending is rather misleading. How so? Surely we should be pretty worried about the staggering cost of servicing our debt.
Well, first of all, I think we should certainly be worried about how much debt we've got and what will happen if inflation and interest rates continue to rise, because obviously the higher the stock of your debt, the more that debt costs to service when the costs associated with that are rising. So I don't dismiss the importance of this figure altogether. But I think it is misleading. Most people, when they saw this 83 billion figure, assumed that was the amount of money that the government would actually have to pay out in debt interest next year, that it was basically a cash flow that was comparable to the amount of money that the government, as you say, was spending on defence or close to what it might be spending on other things like education. That's not quite right. Now this gets quite technical, but if you look at the detail, the main component of debt interest costs that jumped was the cost of servicing inflation index linked debt. Now, about a quarter of government debt, the value of that debt is directly linked to the RPI measure of inflation. So when the RPI measure of inflation goes up, that debt is worth more to the people that hold it. It's a bigger liability for the government. The key point, though, is that money, that additional money, won't have to be paid by the government until the bonds mature. In other words, until investors redeem them. And the average maturity of index-linked debt at the moment is more than 18 years. So that £83 billion will have to be paid out, but over many years and maybe even decades. Now, it's still money the government has to find, but finding 83 billion in 18 years' time is a lot less costly than finding 83 billion now. And it's certainly not directly comparable to the sort of annual budgets for a department like Defence or Education.
So do you think that the reports and the way the government is representing this number as something that we need to claw back immediately and as a justification for potentially not going ahead with tax cuts or not going ahead with further welfare payments, is that why they're doing this? Is that why they're using these comparisons? Is that why the media is reporting it in this way? Or do you think it's just a misunderstanding?
No, I'm sure that they've deliberately used this number in order to not quite to scare people, but to warn people what would happen if debt was allowed to spiral out of control. And to be fair to the Treasury and to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the 83 billion figure is correct if you're looking at this on an accruals rather than a cash basis. So this isn't a number that they've made up, it's a true number. But I do think it's misleading because the way it's being presented is to say that, well, actually, we can't afford to cut taxes more now, or we can't afford to increase benefits because we're already spending 83 billion in the coming financial year on debt interest. But if you remember that 83 billion is actually spread over a much, much longer period of time, then the immediate impact on the public finances is essentially zero. And it's not a good excuse at all for not doing a little bit more to help businesses and households with the cost of living crisis now.
I guess it makes sense then from a political point of view, insofar as if the government were seen to take a more relaxed approach to this debt pile, would that be seen as potentially giving the go-ahead to keep running deficits forever, essentially? Surely getting the finances back on a stable footing should be the priority of any chancellor following a crisis, and this is something that people can understand.
Yes, I think, again, to be fair to the Treasury, they are right to signal that we can't continue spending at the same rate as we did or anywhere near it during the COVID pandemic, and that fiscal discipline is important over the longer term. But circumstances do change. I think what was reasonable to announce back in September or October last year may not be reasonable now when we've had this new shock come along, the global energy crisis, the war with Ukraine, and so on, which I think does justify taking a more flexible approach. The other thing that's changed, actually more favourably, is that there's a small silver lining from higher inflation, which is that actually improves the public finances. Now, obviously, it increases the debt interest bill in one way or another, but it also increases tax revenues. As nominal incomes and prices rise, businesses and households pay more in tax than they would otherwise have done. So not only have we had a big negative shock because of the energy crisis, but also we've had more flexibility, more headroom in the public finances to offset that shock. And I think that's where the Chancellor went wrong. He used only a little bit of that windfall from higher inflation to support businesses and households. I think he should have gone a lot further.
How is the UK economy faring in comparison to our friends in Europe and also across the pond in terms of inflation, the rising cost of living, economic growth? And we've been having pretty slow economic growth, pretty measly economic growth in normal times. And of course, during the pandemic, it slowed down further. How do we get that economic growth back to where it should be?
First point, the inflation problem is pretty much the same everywhere. There are small differences in numbers, typically around the timing of things like when the energy price cap is going to be lifted in the UK. But essentially, all countries are going to see inflation rise to somewhere between 7 and 9%. As a peak sometime over the summer before it falls back. So every single country is facing the same sort of energy price shock. There are differences, though. The US and also the UK actually went into this latest phase of the crisis with more positive momentum than the Eurozone. So if you look at some of the recent business surveys, particularly the Purchasing Managers Survey, the US and the UK are holding up much better than the Eurozone is. I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the UK in particular is one of the first of the major economies to emerge from the COVID pandemic. Obviously, COVID is not gone. We're seeing huge numbers of case numbers, but the lockdown measures that have been slowing growth have been lifted. So the UK economy is in relatively good shape compared to many economies in the rest of Europe. There's still a question of how different countries are responding to the same cost of living crisis. And actually, there isn't an enormous amount of difference. I mean, at one extreme, we do have countries like France that are shielding almost everybody from the impact of higher energy prices. But that's a hugely expensive thing to do, and it's not very efficient. And it also means you're actually giving quite a lot of money to people who could afford to pay higher prices. So it's not very well targeted either. At the other extreme, there are actually plenty of countries in Europe that have seen much bigger increases in inflation than in the UK, perhaps because they don't have the energy price cap that we do, or less room for them to cut other taxes or increase benefits. So it's quite a mixed picture, but overall, the UK economy is going into this crisis in relatively good shape. And in particular, what's happening in the labour market. I know, obviously, focus a lot on the bad news on prices, but wages are also picking up. I think there's some positive stories on business investment as well. As COVID uncertainty clears and as Brexit uncertainty perhaps more gradually clears, I think business investment could rebound strong in the UK as well. So while you could sort of dismiss the strong growth in the UK last year as catching up with the rest of Europe, I think this year the UK is actually going to power ahead.
And just lastly, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but if you had to make some predictions, how high do you think inflation will reach? Do you think it will slow down and come back down soon? Do you think economic growth, if you had to forecast, where do you think it's heading?
Well, in the near term, there's no doubt that inflation is going to be heading higher, not least because we know that at the beginning of April, the energy price cap is being increased, and there are other things happening as well. VAT on hospitality is going up. So in the short term, inflation will head higher. It was 6.2% in February. It'll probably be around 8% at some point in the next few months. What happens later in the year, though, is very difficult to forecast. I mean, a lot of it depends, of course, on what happens in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine could mean that energy prices remain higher for longer, but if it's resolved quickly, then energy prices could drop back pretty quickly as well, in which case, inflation will remain high for a while, but then fall quite sharply. The other part of the picture is, stepping back a bit, what's driving inflation? Well, part of it is the very rapid growth in the money supply that we've had over the last few years. And money supply growth is actually now slowing pretty sharply, based on the usual relationship between money supply growth and inflation. That also, I think, points to inflation dropping quite sharply over the next year or two. So we will get a particularly nasty spike in inflation over the next few months to about 8%. But I think there are good reasons, looking at it from both sides of the equation, lower energy prices, but also slower monetary growth, to suggest that inflation will drop quite sharply thereafter.
Thank you, Julian. Well, that was Julian Jessop, independent economist, economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, just running us through some of those big numbers that we've been seeing, that big debt interest pile, and it's not as clear as the government might want it to appear. So that was the first episode of the Double Take with me, Emily Carver. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please do give us a like, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment below, and we'll see you next time.